The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Fairview, a small American town where nothing ever seemed to happen, until that day. The doors of Maplewood Bank swung open with a creak, and in walked an old man, his weathered face half hidden beneath the brim of a tattered cap. His hunched frame carried a heavy burlap sack slung over one shoulder, the rough fabric stained with age and wear. The few customers in the lobby barely glanced up, but the bank tellers behind the polished counters exchanged amused glances. He looked like a vagrant, the kind of man who might wander in asking for spare change rather than making a deposit. But when he reached the center of the room, he lifted his head, revealing eyes that gleamed with something unreadable determination. Maybe. Or something else. "I am the owner of this bank," he declared, his voice steady despite his frail appearance. Silence hung in the air for a moment before a chuckle broke through. Then another. A security guard smirked. One of the clerks stifled a laugh, and even the branch manager, a man in a crisp gray suit, shook his head in amusement. But their laughter would not last, because within minutes they would realize this was no joke. The laughter spread through the bank like ripples in a pond. A young teller, no older than 25, leaned over to her colleague and whispered something, barely containing her grin. The security guard, a burly man with a badge that read Morris, folded his arms and took a step forward. "Sir," Morris said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "I think you might be confused. Maybe you should take a seat while we call someone to help you." The old man didn't move. Instead, he shifted the sack on his shoulder and let it drop to the marble floor with a heavy thud. The sound was enough to turn heads, enough to make the chuckles die down just a little. "I am not confused," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This bank belongs to me." The branch manager, a middle-aged man named Richard Calloway, let out a sigh and stepped forward. He was used to handling difficult customers, but this was something new. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think that's possible," Calloway said, offering the kind of patient smile one might give to a lost old man. "Do you have an account here?" The old man tilted his head slightly, his wrinkled face unreadable. "Account? Son, I built this bank." Another chuckle rose from the crowd, but this time it was weaker, uncertain. Morris inched closer, his hand resting near his belt. "All right, sir. I think it's time you tell us what's in the sack." The old man finally smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that put people at ease. It was slow, deliberate. A smile that carried history, weight, and something else beneath it. He reached down, fingers curling around the rough burlap. And when he pulled it open, the room changed. The laughter stopped, because now everyone understood. A collective hush fell over the bank as the old man pulled open the sack. The moment stretched long, filled with held breaths and widening eyes. What they expected, a pile of junk, maybe a handful of loose change, wasn't what they saw. Bundles of old, faded banknotes spilled onto the marble floor, thick wads wrapped in paper bands stamped with the Maplewood Bank's original logo, one that hadn't been used in over 50 years. A dusty ledger followed, its leather binding cracked with age, the pages yellowed but still intact. The bank manager, Calloway, blinked as he stared at the notes, his mouth slightly open. His amusement vanished. What is this?" he muttered, stepping forward. The old man gave a slow nod, as if he had been expecting that very question. "Proof," he said simply. "Proof that I built this bank, that I owned it before your father was even born." Morris, the security guard, frowned but didn't move. He was no banker, but even he could tell those bills were real. Calloway swallowed, his mind racing. "That's impossible," he said, though his voice wavered. "Even if you had money from the past, it doesn't mean you." "Check the ledger," the old man interrupted. "My name is in there." Calloway hesitated, then crouched and lifted the book with careful hands. He flipped through the brittle pages, scanning them until his fingers froze. His eyes darted to the old man in disbelief. "J.T. Hollis," he murmured. The old man nodded. "That's me." A woman near the counter gasped. A man near the exit muttered something under his breath. The name wasn't unfamiliar. It belonged to the original founder of the bank. But that was impossible. J.T. Hollis had disappeared decades ago, presumed dead. Calloway shook his head. That can't be you. J.T. Hollis would be over 100 years old by now." The old man's eyes gleamed. "And yet, here I am." A heavy silence settled over the bank. No one was laughing anymore. The weight of the silence pressed down on the room like a thick fog. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the slow, deliberate flipping of the ledger's pages as Calloway skimmed through the records, his face growing paler with each passing second. "This," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "This ledger is over 60 years old." The old man, J.T. Hollis, or so he claimed, let out a small chuckle, though it carried no amusement. "Older than that, son," he said, adjusting his stance. "I started this bank in 1948 with my own 2 hands, and I ran it until the day they took it from me." Calloway's head snapped up. "Took it?" Hollis nodded, his fingers tightening around the edge of the sack. "Stole it. Betrayed me. Erased me." He swept his gaze around the room, landing on the grand chandelier, the polished counters, the fine marble flooring. "They built this on my bones." The security guard, Morris, cleared his throat. "All right, this is getting a little crazy," he muttered. He looked at Calloway. "Boss, you want me to call the cops?" Calloway didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the name in the ledger, the dates, the official signatures that matched the framed documents on the wall behind him. J.T. Hollis was no myth. He had been real. But if this man was him— "That's not necessary," Calloway said slowly. He turned his attention back to the old man. "Mr. Hollis, if that's really you, what happened? Why did you disappear?" The old man exhaled sharply, his lips pressing together in something like restrained anger. "I was betrayed," he said again, "by my own business partner, George Matheson. We built this bank together. He was supposed to be my friend. But greed does things to a man. One day he had the paperwork changed, convinced the board I was unfit to run things. And just like that, I was out. My name was erased. My life was ruined." A murmur spread through the small crowd in the bank. "But that was decades ago," a woman in the back whispered. Hollis nodded. "I fought to get it back. For years I fought. But doors kept closing. People kept looking the other way. Then one day I vanished. Because that's what they wanted, wasn't it?" His voice turned cold. "For me to disappear." Calloway swallowed hard. "And now you're back." The old man nodded once. "I'm back." His fingers tightened around the sack again. "And I'm here to take back what's mine." A chill ran through the room. Morris shifted his stance, uneasy. "All right, sir. I'm gonna have to ask you." Hollis reached into the sack again. People gasped. A woman near the entrance took a step back. Morris' hand flew to his holster. But when Hollis pulled his hand out, it wasn't a weapon he held. It was a stack of papers. Yellowed, stamped, signed. Legal documents. Calloway stepped forward hesitantly and took them from the old man's outstretched hand. His eyes moved over the text, scanning, his face tightening with each line he read. Then he stopped. His hands trembled slightly. "Oh my God," he whispered. "What?" Morris asked, still tense. "What is it?" Calloway lifted his eyes to meet Hollis. "These documents," he swallowed, "they show that you never sold the bank." Hollis gave a small, satisfied nod. That's right. Calloway shook his head in disbelief. If these are real, he turned to look at the framed certificates behind him. Certificates that bore the name Matheson and Sons, the family that had controlled the bank for generations. Then this bank was stolen from you. The crowd murmured louder now. Hollis took a deep breath. I spent my whole life fighting to prove it, and now here I am. Calloway straightened, his mind racing. If the documents were authentic, and they certainly looked authentic, then J.T. Hollis had a legal claim to the very building they were standing in. And that meant the real owner of Maplewood Bank was standing right in front of them. The people who had laughed at him moments ago now stared in stunned silence. Because they were finally realizing the truth. And they were beginning to regret it. The weight of the moment settled over the bank like an approaching storm. Whispers filled the air, hushed voices laced with uncertainty and disbelief. Calloway's hands trembled as he turned the pages of the aged documents, his pulse quickening with every signature, every official seal that confirmed what seemed him. The old man stood motionless, his presence now carrying an undeniable gravity. He had entered the bank as a laughingstock, a relic of the past dismissed as a confused vagrant. Now he was something else entirely, an undeniable force, the specter of a long-buried truth clawing its way by. The polished floors, the high ceilings, the grand chandeliers. Every inch of the building was built on stolen foundations, a monument to deceit. And the man who had been cast aside to be forgotten had returned. Calloway exhaled sharply, his thoughts spinning. This was more than an embarrassment, more than an old man with an unbelievable story. This was a reckoning. If the documents were real, and they certainly looked real, then the entire history of Maplewood Bank was a lie. The employees, once amused, now stood frozen, their gazes darting between Calloway and the old man. The customers, once indifferent, now clutched their belongings a little tighter, as if caught in the middle of something far larger than themselves. The security guard shifted uneasily, fingers still hovering near his belt, uncertain whether this moment demanded authority or restraint. Outside, the world moved on, unaware. Cars passed on the street, pedestrians walked by, oblivious to the revelation unfolding within the bank's walls. But inside, time had slowed. The old man bent down, lifting a bundle of the faded banknotes from his sack. He ran his fingers over the worn paper, tracing the past with the touch of someone who had once held wealth, power, and trust, only to have it stolen away. The weight of the years sat heavy on his shoulders, but his hands were steady. Calloway felt his throat tighten. He had spent his career upholding the legacy of the institution, believing in its history, its traditions. And now that foundation was crumbling beneath him. A decision loomed. Would they acknowledge the truth, unravel the past and set things right? Or would they bury it once more? The room remained silent. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour. And the old man waited. The air inside the bank had shifted. What had started as laughter had dissolved into an uneasy silence, a quiet understanding that something bigger than all of them had just surfaced. The weight of history sat heavy in the marble-lined room, pressing down on the people who had unknowingly played a part in a decades-old injustice. J.T. Hollis stood unmoving, his face impassive but his presence commanding. He had waited a lifetime for this moment, not just to be heard, but to be recognized. His eyes roamed the grand room, taking in the symbols of wealth, the polished brass plaques, the heavy wooden desks, all standing on ground that had once been his. Calloway swallowed hard. He knew what had to be done. His hands, still gripping the documents, felt like they held the weight of the entire bank's history. He turned slowly, stepping toward the back office. The board had to see this. The lawyers would have to be called. But as he reached the door, he hesitated. He already knew how this would go. The bank's owners, the Matheson family, would resist. They would call it a mistake, say the documents were forged, drag the matter through courts for years, hoping time would bury the truth once again. And Hollis? He might not have years left. A quiet murmur spread through the gathered employees. A few of them glanced at one another, uncertain. Then, slowly, a young teller stepped forward. She bent down and carefully lifted one of the faded banknotes from the pile at Hollis's feet. She studied it for a long moment before placing it on the counter, treating it with the reverence of something sacred. Then, as if that single motion had broken the tension, another teller did the same. And another. One by one, the employees moved forward, each placing a piece of Hollis's past onto the counter. His proof, his claim, his legacy. The security guard, Morris, shifted his weight but didn't stop them. His hand, once hovering near his belt, now rested at his side. He gave a small nod in Hollis's direction. The old man watched in silence. He had no more speeches to give, no more battles to fight. He had come with nothing but the truth and the weight of the years behind him. And now, for the first time in decades, he was being seen. Calloway finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "This isn't over," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. No, it wasn't, but it had begun. J.T. Hollis let out a slow breath. He turned and walked toward the door, his steps deliberate, unhurried. He did not look back. He did not need to. Because for the first time in a long, long time, he had won.